Jumping back into some chain of command in this vlog, focusing on support choices and how, if you're new to chain of command, navigating these support choices, not only in terms of usage and tactica, but the two different ways, the two very, very important ways that they operate in the game. Now, at its core, I want to focus on one key element of the rules. I've pushed up to my channel here under the chain of command playlist, various rules analysis, and a quick play for the game, which, on a side note, if you're looking for a really excellent, solid rule set, chain of command is very dynamic and a lot of fun to play. It scales very, very well. But at its core, chain of command, and I am simplifying things here a little bit, based on your army and the type of game that you're playing, you have a number of D6 dice. These are literally your chain of command dice. You roll them on your turn, and based on the numbers, those are the units that you can activate in terms of support units, infantry units, senior commanders, senior officers, junior officers. You also can generate command dice based on, if you roll a 5, those get banked and put off to the side, and you can use those to interrupt or affect other aspects of the game. Now, as you take losses, you roll on various charts depending on the type of loss, whether it's a senior leader, a junior leader, a support choice, and that has the possibility or the guarantee to decrease your chain of command dice. So what's interesting about the game is that as you take losses, not only are you losing the volume of dice, right? If we look at all of my units that I can put out, they're going to generate volume of dice to interact in terms of shooting against my opponent. So not only am I losing the ability of dice, if I have a unit of 10 men, I take 6 losses, I've lost that dice, but I'm also losing the possibility to issue orders, to activate those units. So losses are a really, really big deal in chain of command compared to other type of games, more futuristic type games where you just throw tons and tons of tanks and men, and there's really no consequence whatsoever. It has a very, very interesting tactical feel to it. So within that framework, support choices are interesting because they have the potential to deal a lot of damage or change the game through special rules, and we're going to look at 2 examples of that, followed with the counterbalance that if you lose them rolling on the chain of command chart, you're definitely going to lose dice. And if you spend a chain of command die to prevent that, if you have it banked, that's taking away resources from interrupts or other activations out of turn. So there's a lot of interesting choices within the game. So tactically speaking, the support choices break down into 2 groups, on table and off table. Some of these support choices are available to all of the army nations, certain fortifications, minefields, razor wire. Others are specific. If we look at tanks as a support choice, early war, mid-war, late war is going to determine the type of tanks that you can access. And of course, all of them have a number of support points that you have to pay. Now, in terms of these points, they're really kind of open-ended. The core missions look and say attacker versus defender. Here are the army lists, and here are your support choices. Sometimes we'll go into a game, often I'll play, where we say, hey, you want to get a lot of support on the table? What do we want to do? 15 points each. We just do attacker and attacker, 15 points each. I mean, if you're playing late war and you want to get some of those really amazing tanks into the game, you can never have too many points. So that's your currency to kind of customize and purchase additional units for support. The challenge here is chain of command is interesting because unlike other war games, it acknowledges the table that you and I are physically playing on, that physical table. That's where the action is happening. But it's a small part of a bigger battle. There's stuff going on next to us. There's stuff going on above us. There's stuff happening multiple tables out. So you can select support choices that are off table. What that might represent is a machine gun team that is set up high in the hills somewhere or set up from a vantage point that, given the range of modern weapons, while it's not on the battlefield, it's close enough that it can fire down. So a machine gun team, off-table support choice, you can pick and mark an area of the table that you can shoot at, and then you can activate and call that strike in. There's also air support. There's other off-table elements. It's a question of control. Off-table elements, you activate them, you don't take losses. There's nothing to lose, so you're safe with that. You're putting those points into something that you can activate, and I don't have to worry about losing. But there's a number of what-if conditions that need to be met, meaning I section off a part of the table that says this is where my barrage is coming in, or this is where the machine gun team is set up, and this is where I'm able to shoot. Compared to on-table support, tanks, machine gun teams, mortars, snipers, where if you lose them, you take that loss. You have to roll that chain of command die, but you have mobility, you have flexibility, you have some tactica within that. If I move in with a tank and then suddenly have to redeploy because the battlefield shifts, I can move my tank. Whether I can do that safely or not and not get hit by anti-tank fire or another tank, well, that's an open question, but I have that maneuverability. Or if I take the off-table support, I key off this one area, and for whatever reason, the flow of the battle means we completely avoid that. Well, I'm not losing those support points, but I haven't gained anything from it. So the first thing that I kind of look at in terms of what am I choosing? Now, as a player, we talk about player personality. I'm always loading up on tanks. I always load up on tanks. I'll usually load up on a sniper team because I like the idea of it. I explored a Sniper Tactica, pushed that up to the Chain of Command playlist. It's fun in terms of actual payoff for the points. I mean, there's a lot of what-ifs that have to happen, and it's a very low roll, a D6, to try and hit an officer, but it's kind of cool. It's kind of fun to play. But the tanks are a little bit more robust and guaranteed, whether it's armor-piercing rounds, high explosives, machine guns, from that end. I tend to look at the battlefield itself. I'm always going to have some element of tanks. But if it's going to be a very fast and furious kind of breakout type game, then I kind of want my support choices on the table. Because so much about Chain of Command, there's this idea of jump-off points. So what you see in other traditional war games is you have your deployment zone, you put out all your toys, and I have my deployment zone on my table edge, I put out my toys. Chain of Command takes a different perspective in that a pre-phase of the game has you and I placing these markers, these tokens on the table. And some players use a straight up token. Some players might use just like a battlefield flag or a little terrain. They interact in the game, not in terms of terrain, but in terms of this represents a point where units are somewhere there. Now, this is an interesting concept. You and I, we put off our jump-off points. They have to be behind terrain. Let's say you put one behind a building on the table. What this represents is units that you activate. They can deploy from that part of the table. It's kind of like the fog of war re-implemented. I know that you have units behind that building. I don't know what units they are. Could be a machine gun team, could be a fire team, could be a tank, could be an anti-tank gun, could be any number of things, could be your whole army. As you activate units and deploy them, they come and move from those jump-off points. Capturing and removing jump-off points is massive in the game, simply because not only does it prevent a possible entry point for your opponent's forces, you're cutting off more and more of where they can move, but it also forces a roll on that chart. And again, you can use Chain of Command dice to move a jump-off point, to deny the roll, but you're expending those resources. So mobility is key. Spending support points to get either firepower or mobility. If I'm taking a heavy machine gun team, if I'm taking a mortar team, I'm increasing the firepower of my army, but am I really gaining mobility? If I take tanks or carriers, I'm gaining dice, but I'm also gaining mobility, which is so important in the game. You would think for a World War II kind of based game, we're just kind of lining up and shooting to see who breaks first. Mobility, and of all the wargaming systems that I enjoy, mobility is so huge in chain of command. The ability to cut off parts of the table with overlapping fields of fire, with overwatch, with heavy weapons, to suppress, to kind of move up on the flank. It's a very, very fast, quick playing game. And the support choices are the ones that you need to make that choice based on the map, based on the mission, based on what you want to do. And again, having them break off into on table or off table. Player personality side note, I'm usually jacking up the tanks. I love the tanks, but there are some missions if we're playing in a campaign or a historical battle, a historical type battle. One of the great things about Chain of Command is to really look at historical engagements between units and recreate that. Like we've actually recreated the various roads and villages where, like, at this point on this corner, at this building, there was an engagement, and we get the terrain about 90%, 80, 90% in terms of trees and buildings and walls, and we refight that. So I'd like a heavy tank, but in this engagement, this particular engagement, there was no heavy tank. We try to keep it as real as possible, but there was an off-table machine gun team that set up in kind of the grove of trees over to the right. I will put that there, or at least I'll have it on the table. I might, as a commander, make a decision to put it in a different place, but utilizing the support choices, asking those questions, and understanding the dynamics of Chain of Command.